Hello and welcome everyone to the first episode of our new podcast series, where we are going to bring together CEOs, COOs of different companies and basically open a discussion on current issues, current trends we see in the utility sector, with the kickoff actually of this series, where we will be interviewing our own COO, Ennio Neumann-Senesi, recently appointed 1 year in now, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's correct.
Welcome, Ennio.
Yeah, my pleasure.
First of all, Ennio, would you for those of the listeners that don't know you yet, could you please introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about your background and how you got to becoming the COO of UMS Group.
Okay, well, you got a day. Really, I started with UMS back in October last year, and the background to this was my ongoing conversations with Jack Sherman, the founder and CEO of UMS, which is a very, very compelling, intriguing personality. I think Jack Sherman is one of the most knowledgeable people in the utility sector that I've ever seen. So I was very impressed, and he had very strong ideas, and I was on a moment in my life where I was thinking, okay, so what am I going to do when I grow up? Am I going to be an independent consulting doing a bit of work here, a bit of work there, or do I enter into a small boutique where I can contribute to the growth and basically enhance the proposition and bring out the jewels of the basement, as I call them, that UMS definitely has? And would that be my choice? So it became, of course, the latter option. Jack and I very quickly agreed on the terms, and I took the steering wheel as of October last year. And before that, my background and my pedigree, or my guild, if you like, is management consultancy. I do that for about 36 years, probably 36 years. Been with Accenture, A.T. Kearney, Shell for many years, Proudfood, where I've learned the trade many years ago. I spent about 8 years in private equity, setting up new companies, always in the energy sector, so oil and gas, to a lesser extent utilities, and full value chain.
So, hearing that's basically a whole career path for as far as I know, the fossil industry. Having come to UMS Group as a management consultancy, obviously you see the changes happening the last years, the energy transition. Looking back on your last year in UMS, what's the most noticeable about what you've seen in the utility sector?
Well, good question, by the way. The conversion from, let's say, conventional consulting, asset management, optimization, performance, helping companies out on their processes, making them more efficient, and all of that is still very, very valid. But the overhanging, audacious, hairy goal is the energy transition, and the fact that most companies need to be carbon neutral by 2030, or a little bit later, but 2030. The carbon neutrality is going to kick in for many companies in the asset-intensive industries, not just limited to utilities.
And if you look at the energy transition as it's going now, obviously we have the Paris Agreement, we have the 2030, 2050 goals. Looking at the industry from your point of view, are we on the right track?
Yeah, well, what is the right track, right? I mean, if the question is, are we heading for the goals that have been also established in the Paris Agreement? On that one, I have to admit I'm a little bit pessimistic. I just don't see enough movement, enough commitment, enough sense of urgency. I mean, let me give you the example, right? You had this, we had this COP, where was it?
Scotland.
Yeah, in Glasgow, right? A great event, and then you see, all those people being flown in with planes, and I even heard the anecdote that people were been driving around in Teslas, but there weren't sufficient sockets with real power, and they were basically powered with diesel generators. I mean, yeah, it was just one of those anecdotes, which for me illustrates there's a lot of lip service, and I don't see sufficient action. The other thing is that I think that the correlation between environment and climate is not sufficiently boosted, because I think the whole world situation, not just the energy transition per se, should be considered in a, let's say, a holistic approach. So we should not just look at one parameter that's a threat to the world and to society, because there are many threats to society and to the world, existential threats, and the environmental issues are not less important than climate change per se. That's, yeah, so that's my line of thinking, and but I don't see too many people having the same thought about it, and especially policymakers, because policymakers are driven by the electorate. The electorate is driven by their wallet and by their concerns. So politics have become a very symptomatic management of sentiments and polls, and then basically real long-term visions for 5, 10, 20 years with implementable steps. That is that doesn't seem to be in place. I don't see it.
And do you think regulatory changes could make a difference in this transition, or should the incentive come from somewhere else?
Well, everything in life, every process in life has a value chain, right? So incentives could be part of the value chain to achieve a certain objective. The regulator is important, but who drives the regulator? What motives do the regulator have to install, impose, or mandate new regulations onto society, onto companies? Who's going to pay for it at the end? There are many questions, and I personally, but that's my personal belief, and I don't represent my company because, by the way, this is a personal interview, right? So I think I have a little bit of more liberal look at this. I don't think that the regulator should be imposing all kinds of things, especially when they are not done from a holistic perspective. But yeah, I mean, it also depends on the jurisdiction where you are, which country do you live. If you live in a place where everything is highly privatized or commercialized, it's a different discussion as when you are in a highly regulated country. The Netherlands used to be a very highly regulated country, and there are less so, but the regulation level is still very much there, right? So people still expect the government and the state to take care of things. Mm-hmm. Whereas in other countries, the US as the first one, that's not necessarily the case so much there.
Part of the energy transition is the phasing out of carbon emissions, obviously. For a country that's not heavily regulated, that doesn't have that governmental body that says we need you to phase out, we want you to phase out before a certain time, what could be their incentive to phase out anything carbon emitting?
Yeah, again, another good question. Yeah. Okay, so it's commercial, right? If people see that eventually, over the longer term, hydrocarbons are become more expensive, It's what we already see now. So that automatically will create the urge to think differently, to look for alternative sources of energy.
But do you mean this in the form of more expensive coal or gas, or do you mean more expensive emissions, as in emissions being taxed?
But you just said in a non-regulated environment.
Fair enough.
Okay. So in a non-regulated environment, it's commercial. It's driven first and foremost because if you live in a non-regulated environment, as some states of the US are, for example, you automatically the mentality of the people is, first of all, is basically asset-driven, is money-driven. If this becomes really expensive, we can no longer afford it, so therefore we have to change. And by the way, the emissions eventually are causing havoc in our environment, and therefore, over the longer term, we may impact negatively the quality of the lives of our children and grandchildren. So that may be like a calling type of motivation, where the other one is more an ambition to spend as little as possible on energy, right? So that's what I think would trigger. And by the way, you already see it, because places like California and to some lesser extent Florida, they have already developed a lot more alternative and renewable strategies on energy with solar and wind, more than other states in the US do, I think. And well, in Europe, it's already a lot more than they thought they would be having 10 years ago. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you see, or who would you call out as the most, or the key drivers in this energy transition?
Key drivers in the energy transition. I think society. And society, of course, then what is society? Society is the makeup of people, companies, and entities, and everything else. But I think this is a public-driven initiative, and the academia not to forget. And of course, what you also see is that almost any urgency in the world is sometimes hijacked by who is in power, just to force some changes to gain a better side or more control. I know this sounds sometimes a little bit awkward, but that's also the case. If sometimes you see governments that would have never embraced these policies are now, really embracing these policies, and I sometimes doubt their motives. Really, is it really for the environment, or is it because that's a way of mapping, the standards of where people are, really, and even probably increasing a level of control as well. But generally, I think the initiative is driven by ideology first, and that's how most of these initiatives are basically come to fruition.
Yeah, and then what you're saying is we can see this motivation, this society-driven motivation, will reflect in how a company positions itself in the energy transition, because they'll respond to whatever society's demands or wishes are.
I don't know if they respond to whatever the demands are, but they are definitely, okay, let me give you an example. A major oil company, right? Back in the days, not too long ago, there were NGOs like Greenpeace, who were with all kinds of actions, basically protesting against an oil company. Now, most of the cases was kind of won, if you can call it like that, by Greenpeace. Why? Because they got the attention, and it was negative attention for the oil company, and the oil company then had to basically come with statements. And why? Because in the public domain, if the opinion is negative, it has an impact on the share value as well, because publicly quoted companies are suffering from those type of things too. So there are some levers there that in the public domain are used and sometimes, in my mind, abused as well.
And looking at that change, looking at that transition, and kind of bringing it back to our playing field, what would you consider, or how do you think the utility of the future should position itself? What is the utility of the future in your eyes?
Well, let's start by saying that there are certain basic needs for everything, right? So electricity is a critical part of that. So no matter what the utility of the future is, the output will always be electricity. So if you do a bit of reverse engineering and take in consideration the variables that we have, so we need to be carbon neutral, let's say in 20, 30 years. We need to produce electricity. Currently we have, as renewables, we have, or let's say sustainable, we have solar, wind, we have tidal, we have geothermal, we have likely we are going to have hydrogen as well, right? But there's a discussion, the brown, green, or gray, green or blue hydrogen sources. That's still open for debate. So the utility of the future will be surfing, and it would require probably more flexibility than there is today. The utility sector especially is a very conventional, I would say almost old-fashioned, a little bit like the oil industry. Old industry, conventional industries, difficult to change. And the change here is that the agility to be able to digest any new technology and embrace any new technology and getting it on the grid, transmitted and distributed, that's the key. So the agility in the industry, in the utilities of the future, I think is the key element. Because now, CapEx planning is like 10, 20 years. So you want to build a gas-fired, well, until a couple of years ago, you made a plan for a gas-fired power plant, and you know that was going to last for 30, 40 years maybe, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the technology, and you just need to make sure that it can be done more efficiently over time, but the basics remain the same. So now it's changing because we don't know in 10 years or 20 years how hydrogen is going to evolve. I share the scenario of us not needing cables anymore because we have fuel cells in our house that can power, that can generate the electricity for a house, and then you just change it, and then a truck passes by and they swap the fuel cell, and that's it. So it would be a completely different industry and a different type of market approach, I suppose. But most of all, from a technological perspective, it would require a major change.